very rare diseases floating around the waiting room at the ER. I don't need those. And so I didn't do that. But saw the ophthalmologist this morning, and so that's why my eyes look super puffy, because first they do the numbing drops, which sting, and then they did the dilation. So I'm sure my eyes are nice and big, and everything's sort of foggy and fuzzy at the moment. But no retinal tear, no retinal separation. Basically, long story short, and hey, for those of you who are getting into your 60s, I didn't have this information, so maybe it'll be helpful to you. The vitreous humor in your eyeball shrinks with age. And as it pulls away, it can damage things by pulling the retina with it. Or sometimes it can pull away and the retina stays right where it's supposed to. But when you think about it, you don't have sensing nerves in your retina. You only have light sensing nerves. They don't sense pain. So they don't transmit pain signals. They transmit light signals. So if something happens inside your eye, such as the vitreous humor pulling away from a part of the retina, that would cause pain, but the only thing that those nerves can report to your brain is light. Hence the flashes of light that I saw, and still see a little bit, only once it's very, very dark inside. One of the first things the doctor said was cataracts, and I'm like, I don't like that. But he basically said pretty much everybody at your age has them. The question is how fast they develop. And with a rather deadpan look on his face, I did get him to smile a few times. I did my best. I really did. But he said, I would say you might want to have these dealt with, because my wife had a cataract, and she had the whole lens replaced about 10, 15 years ago. Yeah, probably about 15. And it was fast, and she's had great vision ever since then. And but he said, yeah, probably between 40 and 14 years from now. So between 76 and 102. Okay, if you say so. Now, I almost feel like trying to talk him into it, just simply, I am sadly getting to the point where I'm contemplating donating my telescopes, at least all but one of them. The smaller, lighter, easy to set up one that I can look at planets and stuff like that with, I'll keep. But the big ones, my vision just isn't sharp enough to really do that much with them anymore. But then, the other option would be talk him into replacing at least one of them and get good vision back to be able to use the telescopes. Who knows? Probably won't do that. Probably won't do that at all. But anyway, so that's good news. I was very concerned that the upcoming trips to Conway and Jonesboro at the end of next month, and then to Livingston, not all that long after that. I'm going to drive back, be home just a couple of weeks, and drive all the way back to Louisiana. That those might get messed up by all this, but if they're going to get messed up, they're not going to get messed up by my eyes anyways. Who knows what else could go wrong. But there you go. Hey, just saw a picture of Joe Boot. At least he's not wearing those salmon-colored slacks. That's much better, Joe. Much better. Still, the brown and those shoes, I don't know, guy. But anyways, filming Worldview curriculum in Lexington, Kentucky today with my colleagues. Well, good. We need all of that we can possibly get. All right. Tons and tons and tons of stuff happening in the world, obviously, as everybody knows. When I was driving over here, and yes, I'm driving through a fog right now, but it's amazing what you can see even through a fog. I'm thinking, and my fellow elders mentioned this on Apologia Radio on Thursday, I think it was. Yeah, Thursday afternoon. I've mentioned this. I mentioned this to them on Monday at the inauguration. I was like, look, I appreciate all the positive stuff that's happening. I appreciate defunding Planned Parenthood. I appreciate there's two genders, and I all this stuff I appreciate. But I just have to recognize this is supposed to be being done by the legislature. It's supposed to be done by the legislative branch. This isn't the role of the executive. And it's not the role of the judicial either, for that matter. And I just can't imagine what we would be feeling and thinking if things had been different in November and all this stuff was being done in reverse. And I also can't help but think that the American populace is so fickle and has such short memories. What's going to happen when the other side gets back in power and has both the Senate and the House? Because they're even more radical. It's just not this isn't the way it's supposed to be done. We are electing kings now instead of presidents. The Congress is worthless. The left will not, there is no such thing as bipartisanship. When I was young, people worked together for the good of the country. That doesn't happen anymore. So the legislative branch is pretty much dead. The judicial has taken over a lot of that. And so who controls the court means everything now. That's why you saw the left put pure ideologues that have absolutely no place being on the court. And the executive branch has become the royal branch, the king. And if you rejoice in it now, you're not going to have a whole lot of basis for griping about it when the other side's doing the same thing. And it obviously can't last. The Constitution was written not fully by Christian men. There's no question about that. But it was written in a Christian milieu. And it utilizes Christian categories of government, law, mankind, male, female. And hence, I don't know how long it can last in a context of secularism. And people on the right and the left right now are secularists. And they operate within that context. And that's rough. That's ugly. And we'll see what happens with it. All right. So, wonderful time at church last night. Jeff got done preaching. He comes down, stands next to me. I think there's a song going on. It was after the supper. And I looked at the clock, and I went up to Jeff, and he leans over for me to talk to him, and I go, "You feeling okay?" He goes, "Yeah." Because there was a chance that I was going to have to preach yesterday afternoon. He had called me Saturday night, said, "I may be coming down with something, just to give you a heads up, start thinking about something." I said, "Okay, I appreciate it." And so I had some thoughts in mind, and yesterday morning, we do outreach to the Mormons at various ward chapels around the valley. There's hundreds of them. And we just stand outside the entrances to the parking lots, obviously, and talk to people if they want to talk, pass out tracts, they want to stop, take a tract. And so I went out. My son-in-law heads up our outreach to the Mormons, and so most of my grandkids were out there. So I went out and had a fairly lengthy conversation with the young man. At the time, did not feel like it was overly useful, to be honest with you, but you never know. There have been many times. I remember talking to a woman once, came up to me and said, there's no way you could remember this, but years and years ago, you all were outside the general conference, and we were passing out tracts, and man, we said horrible things about you folks, and we took tracts and tore them up and threw them away. But that was what started my journey out of Mormonism. So you never know. You can't tell by that particular conversation at that particular point in time. And so it had already been a long day with the outreach, and the ward chapel was farther away than the church is, and the church is 35 minutes one way on freeways. It's about 35 miles. And so I get home last night after a good service, good time with the saints, and I sit down at the computer just to sort of check stuff, wondering what I'm going to do, depending on what happened with the eye appointment this morning. And lo and behold, Corey Mahler has decided to come after me. And I'm not sure what caused this. Rich, I don't know that you have access to this to my laptop since you're remote. I'm not sure if, and I certainly don't have it since the ATEM's not on, so I have no way of getting to it. So I'm not sure whether that's even a possibility or not. He says 1 second, okay? 1001, 1002, 1003. You know how slowly that goes. Well, Rich, I've got it up here on my screen. We'll see if he can track it down and put it up there for you. But I get home and I sit down at the computer, and there it is. And here's Corey J. Mahler. Now, those of you who don't know who Corey J. Mahler is, he is an excommunicated Lutheran, excommunicated for general hatred of mankind, is what I had been told. The video of his excommunication was posted again today by somebody online. But he is the head of the Stone Choir cult, and it is a cult. And I don't know what I said yesterday, honestly, to trigger this, but I offer you this advice, hos eleutheroi, which means as free men, for those of you who are wondering from Peter's epistles. Retire, take what remains of your legacy and let it stand on its own without continuing to tear it down. If you decline, I can assure you that absolutely nothing will remain when you and we are done. Now it sounds like it's supposed to be a little bit on the threatening side, don't you think? I can assure you that absolutely nothing will remain when you and we are done. Done with what? Who knows? But I don't take real well to being threatened by cult leaders. And I didn't take too well to that. And I said, I'm going to stand firm against people like you and your movement, for as long as the Lord gives me breath and the ability to do so. And I will train younger men to take up that task when I'm no longer capable of doing that, because, I said in a later tweet, you sound just like Joseph Smith, and he does. There's a lot of parallels between this movement. Now, what's different, of course, is this movement isn't really in person very much. It's primarily online, which allows it to spread widely, but it gives it a very different character. A little bit actually harder to fight in some ways, because electronic access to people is ubiquitous now. And, but, he was claiming to, that he teaches the scriptures, and all the rest of this kind of stuff. And I'm like, yeah, Joseph Smith said the same thing. Charles Taze Russell, Judge Rutherford, Ellen G. White, they all said that they were teaching the scriptures purely and all the rest of this stuff. No, I challenge you to find a single lie in anything we've said on the Stone Choir podcast and all the rest of this stuff. Well, that was late last evening. So I had written 2 or 3 responses, and I went to bed. I had to get up this morning, get ready for an important doctor's appointment. see how things are developing and going and what's going on in my eye. And so after they've put the drops in, the numbing drops and all that type of stuff, hard to see real clearly, but thankfully I was still able to pretty much read my phone because it was a busy place, and so you have to sit in this waiting room, then you go to that place and do this, and they take pictures and all that kind of stuff. And so all of a sudden, up pops this. It may have even been before I left the house this morning. Now that I think about it, where it started, anyways. Up comes this statement from Corey Mahler about the name Yahweh. Now, let me back up just 1 second. Last night, when I responded to him, one of his responses to me was, "I'm sure you'd have leveled the same slander against Luther, among others." I guess he's talking about the fact that he's excommunicant. That's public knowledge. That's not slander. That's a fact. He is an excommunicated man. The problem, Mr. White, is that what you are now defending is neither the gospel nor truth. You are defending the sinking ship of liberalism. You are defending a false god you have chosen unwisely. I feel like looking for the Holy Grail at that last line, but you are defending the sinking ship of liberalism. Now, some people thought that that's a small L, and so some type of liberal theology or something along those lines. Now, he's talking about, in his own way, the post-war consensus stuff, globalism, denial of sovereign nations, stuff that, of course, I don't defend or promote in any way, shape, or form. But in his mind, when you're a cult leader, what you define as most important and what you say is connected to something else just is, because no one can question you. And so for some reason he thinks that since I oppose his white nationalist, ethnic animus, cult-like perspectives, that makes me a champion of post-war consensus and the rest of that kind of silliness. And a false god. I mean, the confusion and the category catastrophe that is Corey Mahler and his people is pretty amazing stuff. And so, I had a number of people, even last night, saying, just ignore this guy. He's not worth you're taking your time. And I'm like, no, I disagree. In fact, I wrote to a guy who said, you're wasting your time. And I said, he is a cult leader. He is building a cult. It is best to keep an eye on what he's up to. He had said you should block him. I said, it's best to keep an eye on what he's up to. True believers must be warned. Like those that Paul fought against, he and his followers sneak in. Parais duo. I put the term from Galatians for those who would want to do that type of thing. Sneak in this modern period through social media. Their goal is to draw away disciples after them. And again, I gave the quote from Acts 20:30. They are lukoi barais, savage wolves. When Paul warned the Ephesian elders about such men, he did not tell them to block those folks or ignore these false teachers, but to expose them, resist them, rebuke them, and protect the flock, no matter what the cost. And I think that's what we need to be doing as well. And I can't help but think about, going back to the parallel with Mormonism, I have it in my library over in the other room. The first book seeking to expose and repudiate Mormonism, I guess you'd call it the first anti-Mormon book, was by E.D. Howe, Mormonism Unveiled. Off the top of my head, I think it was 1834, and the vast majority of LDS doctrine that is significant today didn't exist in 1834. Joseph didn't start getting his polytheistic ideas till about 1838. Rich says 1835. Okay. And so, Howe's book is very useful, very interesting. Given when it was written, it wouldn't be all that useful or interesting today in the sense that the Mormonism he was responding to, that's not how it stayed. It changed over time. But I've often thought, what would it be like to live in the time period where a cult was starting? I suppose you could argue we all always live in the time period where a cult is starting. We just don't necessarily know it. And when you think about early Mormon history, the Danites, it would have been really hard back then for people to get hold of information until Smith started, got a printing press and started doing a newspaper and publishing Revelations, and it made it a little bit easier for people, but still in comparison to today, it would be really hard to track down original sources, have really good argumentation and stuff like that. But today, we have a cult starting right under our noses. And most people are like, block them, ignore them. Too much negativity out there. Or on the other side, it's like, oh, you're being too harsh. I mean, these guys they've got good production value. Well, so do the Mormons. They've got all the money in the world to have the best films and slick as can be, man. Have you ever seen the Ensign magazine? Production value has nothing to do with truth at all. But I think that's where we are, is we are in a situation where we have a cult starting, and the cult is not centered in a location. It's not trying to form a actual physical church, but is a cult of the internet. And that kind of stuff already exists in, a lot of the Black Hebrew Israelite stuff transcends one particular area, and you've got a lot of things like that within the electronic realm. But here's a cult that sneaks in, spies out, goes through the back door, via means of the iPhone and the Droid and so on and so forth, and gets, steals converts, pulls them away, gets followers for themselves, and that's what Stonechoir is. And he's like, well, just show me where I'm wrong. And I'm like, oh yeah, I really want to spend a lot of time with all your stuff. But then he just comes along and provides me with the perfect example. It's like, what? So I think I saw this morning. Let me see. Hey, I did that myself. I blew it up a little bit. Here's what was it? What was the context? I was responding to someone, and I was responding to him. Oh no, this is what I responded to this. Okay. Here he says, the Lord God, whose name is most certainly not the demon Yahweh, rank Judaizing is a sure mark of the apostate. So I'm not sure if you can put that up, but my response to him was, man, I wasn't asking for examples, but since you've provided it to me, great, fine, wonderful. The Lord God, whose name is most certainly not the demon Yahweh, rank Judaizing is a sure mark of the apostate. So if you make reference to Yahweh, a name that appears over 6,000 times in the Old Testament, in the original language of the Old Testament, which is Hebrew, then evidently you are some kind of a rank apostate. And I saw someone else mentioning that they ran this particular tweet past Grok, the Twitter AI assistant, and even he made mention of Marcionism. When I say he, it made mention of Gnosticism, Marcionism, things like that, which is an accurate analysis. The real Gnostics, not the Valentinian Gnostics who tried to very specifically mimic Christianity, but the regular Gnostics, probably their mythology developed prior to encountering a lot about Jesus. It's a mishmash. I mean, there is no single Gnostic systematic theology. But the Gnostics who didn't try to look like Christians identified Yahweh as the demiurge. Yaldabaoth was another term they used. And this was a lesser deity, almost a mutation in a sense, because he had come about by Sophia, wisdom, not remaining faithful to her consort. It's a really messed up system. Obviously, it's very strange. But so there was a anti-Yahweh element to Marcionite Gnosticism, and you wonder if that's not. I doubt that's the origin of this, but it's a fascinating parallel that takes place. And so I'm sitting here, and I responded. I think what I wrote, 5 hours ago, and I just put cult leaders doing cult things. And then I quoted Deuteronomy 4:35 in Hebrew. And I have that in accordance here. So I want you to see, because, I put the Hebrew in there, but for me anyways, it's not all that easy to read in Twitter because of the line stuff. You can put it in correctly, but it won't stay that way when it everybody else reads it. And so the Hebrew frequently, because Hebrew's obviously right to left, not left to right, the line spacing is different, line orientation, justification, stuff like that. So I put Deuteronomy 4:35 in, and I also put in a text from Jeremiah chapter 10. But here is, and if it's possible to go full screen on that, because it's just, for me, that's way too small for me to even see it from here. There we go. So this is, I've told you, don't worry about putting me up. Let me blather here a second. This was one of the verses that we had on our Witnessing with the Word t-shirt. And this was a t-shirt we made in the 1980s. Silk screening was still a fairly new thing back then. And this was definitely one of them, Deuteronomy 4:35, where you can see, to you it was shown that you might know that Yahweh hu ha-Elohim ein od milvadu. So that you might know from Yada, what is it you might know? Yahweh, he is ha-Elohim, the God. Definite article. He is God. He is the God. There is none besides him. Now, most of the disputation, I would assume, because when you're involved in apologetics, you have to predict what your opponent is going to be, how they're going to be responding to various points you make. And so, in general, that you will find so much garbage about the name Yahweh online. I mean, you can find anything and everything. I had someone come up to me at church a couple years ago. Hey, I heard someone say that Yahweh was a demon god, and what in the world? And I'm like, yeah, what in the world is that all about? Part of the disputation is about pronunciation. I had a guy on Twitter just this morning say, well, where do the A and the E come from in Yahweh? When you look at Yahweh, you need to remember, if you go back to the Isaiah scroll found at Qumran, you will find that it is consonantal text only. Just like the earliest Quranic manuscripts are consonantal texts. Semitic languages are consonantal. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have vowel letters that can function in that way, but the dots, dashes, and various and sundry other items that you see underneath and mixed in with the letters, even on the screen in front of you right now, were added primarily by the Masoretes long after they were originally written. That's why, for example, Anthony Buzzard is wrong with his argumentation in Psalm 110 when he says, well, this actually disproves the deity of Christ because it's Adoni, not Adonai, and Adoni is always a human, but of course, whether it's Adonai or Adoni was dependent upon the people who inserted the vowel pointing at a later point in time, and of course they were the Masoretes and they were Jews. They already knew how the Christians used Psalm 110, and so they vowel pointed it to try to substantiate their side of things. So what you get is you get the argument that, well, we don't know what letters. They put the vowel pointing for Adonai so that you'd be reminded to read Adonai, my Lord, rather than reading Yahweh. But the reality is, for people who aren't trying to sell books, aren't trying to start a cult, aren't trying to draw disciples away after themselves, the most logical, reliable, predictable pronunciation of the Tetragrammaton, Yod He Waw He, right there, Yod He Waw He, right there, 4 letters. The most logical way of pronouncing that is Yahweh. Now, if you want to argue Yahweh or something, then you have to make that type of argumentation and go for it if you want to. It doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is, this is the covenant name of God. And when it says, I will exalt your name, O Lord, in the LSB, that'll be, I'll exalt your name, O Yahweh. And the Jews stopped pronouncing the divine name. And so, when the Greek Septuagint, over here on the right, was translated into the Greek language, it says, Hati Kurios ha Theasu. So Kurios, Lord, is your God. And you can see the same thing in Deuteronomy 6:4. This is very important because this ends up being cited by Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, et cetera, et cetera. This one is God, and there is none besides him. So the Greek translation is accurate, but instead of, there is a term, Adonai, which means Lord. So how would you differentiate that? The Greek Septuagint really doesn't. You don't have any way of really knowing where the Tetragrammaton is being used just from the Greek Septuagint itself. It uses the term kurios. Now, of course, kurios is the term used of Jesus. No one can say Jesus Christ is kurios, Jesus kurios, except by the Holy Spirit. So kurios is obviously extremely important because of the fact that it represents the divine name. And when you can demonstrate that the Old Testament is being quoted in the New and the divine name was in the original, then that's extremely significant when you get to the Old Testament, the New Testament text, and what the writers are communicating to us about who Yahweh is. And so just go back to last year's debate on is Jesus Yahweh, and you'll see why that is very, very important. So most of the argumentation will be, well, it should be Jehovah, or it should be this. We know it's not Jehovah. Jehovah is a 3-syllable word. This isn't a 3-syllable word. So, it's not that. But that's generally what the argumentation is. Well, we don't know the pronunciation, blah, 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 blah. That's irrelevant. Yahweh is the best pronunciation by people who aren't trying to sell books. And then how it is then used in the New Testament is extremely important. And the fact of the matter is, Yahweh, he is God. This is the God of the Old Testament. Once you start saying the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament are different gods, you have graduated to full-blown Gnosticism and are the heretic that everyone knew you were all along, and your mom probably knew that too. So, anyway, so there's Deuteronomy 4:35. Yahweh, he is Ha Elohim. And by the way, for those of you who witness to Mormons, this is the verse, you're looking at the verse on the screen right now, that got me kicked out of the visitor center at the Mesa LDS Temple many, many years ago. They've closed that visitor center down, opened a different one up across the street now. But I was asking two elderly missionaries to explain this to me, to explain how I was using the King James Version of the Bible, their version of the Bible, showed it to them. I'd showed them how Lord, L-O-R-D in all caps, is Jehovah. And in 1901, the Mormon Church, the first presidency, put out an official statement identifying the Father as Elohim and the Son as Jehovah. And you can go ahead and take that down. And that actually probably goes against Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith didn't understand these things. Joseph Smith could not read these languages, did not have access to these languages. So when I showed them, in the LDS temple ceremonies, Jehovah and Elohim are separate and distinct individuals. But in the Bible, they're not separate and distinct individuals. There's only one God, Yahweh. And so they asked me to leave. And this was the verse that got me in trouble at that particular point in time. So this is one of two. I also went to Jeremiah chapter 10, and which we talked about in the Divine Line just last week, and talked about how that likewise identifies Yahweh and Elohim. And so if you're talking to a Mormon, this is valuable stuff to use. But I am uncertain of exactly what Mahler's problem is. I would assume it is some kind of the Jews are so terribly bad that the name of God that they used, we can't have anything to do with that. So here's the next thing that Mahler posts, and I'm like, well, here we go. Nothing like providing me with all the examples I could ever want of just how messed up your theology really is. God not only caused his word to be translated into Greek, but he then went one step further and destroyed the Hebrew language, which remained extinct for nearly 2,000 years. God could not have been more clear. The scriptures are Greek. Now, this is fascinating. Now, we know Mahler is a cultist. We know he's a cult leader. Okay, you can't take anything he says seriously, but it struck me as fascinating. So God inspired the Septuagint? Which one? Which one? There is no one Septuagint. Anyone who is familiar with the history of that venerable ancient translation knows that there isn't just one of them, because it wasn't all done at one time. The mythological story that was passed around, even amongst Christians, was that 70, or in some versions 72, scholars were brought together. They all went into caves. They translated the entire Old Testament, came back out, compared their translations, and they were word for word the same, which demonstrated that this was a tremendous miracle, and therefore this is how God wants his scriptures to be, the Old Testament scriptures, to be understood, because this took place before the birth of Christ. And the problem is, of course, once you actually work with the Septuagint, where did I put mine? Well, did I take that in the other room? Why would I do that? I don't know, but it looks like I did because, yep. Wow, that's weird. I thought for sure I had left at least one of them in here for illustrative purposes, shall we say. But no, it done be gone. I'm not going to run to the room and grab one. But, I mean, nope, that's not it. That's not it. Nope, it's not in here. Anyone who spends a lot of time, and if you work with New Testament citations of the Old Testament, you will be spending a lot of time with the Greek Septuagint, because at least 85 to 95, depending on whose study you're reading, 85 to 95% of the citations of the Old Testament in the New Testament are from the Greek. And there are some differences between what is cited. For example, we've talked about this many times on the program. Hebrews chapter 8. Hebrews chapter 8, Jeremiah chapter 31 in the Hebrew, though I was a husband to them, but when it's cited in Hebrews chapter 8 in the Greek, it's though I did not care for them. And this is a textual variant in the Hebrew between Baal and Gaal. Bet and Gimel look somewhat alike, at least they're not completely different. And so it's just a one letter difference. And you can see the manuscripts that have the different readings. You can see that represented. There's something called the Göttingen Septuagint that is, as far as I know, the most extensive critical text of the Greek Septuagint. So it gives you all the variant readings and stuff like that. You can get it in Logos, you can get it in Accordance, and you'll be able to see the cross-contamination between the various traditions, between the Hebrew Masoretic text. There was no Masoretic text at that time. There was what we would call a proto-Masoretic text. The Masoretic text really develops long after the time of Christ. And it certainly existed in its earliest form in the days of Christ. You see that in the Isaiah scroll or the Leviticus scroll, where you have scrolls that were written 100 years before Christ, and now that we can read them, they've been discovered, are basically unchanged. 1,000 years later, 900 years after Christ, when the first great Hebrew codices become available. So you do not have to have corruption, but you can have corruption. It's not just a necessary element of the transmission of the text in handwritten form. Anyway, the textual history of the Old Testament in the first century is extremely complicated, extremely complex. The vast majority of people have not ever read Emmanuel Tov or anything like that. To have any type of background in that area, it's not easy to discuss and to go through. But the point is, there is no one Greek Septuagint. You know that the translation, the translation, wet the whistle there a second. The translation varies greatly in its quality. So the Pentateuch, well done. Psalter, yeah, really can be. Major prophets, yeah, but you get into some of the historical books and some of the minor prophets, and not only do you have questionable translation, but questionable text. It didn't all happen at once. Maybe the Pentateuch was done at once, and then some of the major prophets after that, and the Psalter, the more popular stuff, and then later stuff comes later. And it's not all done by the same group of people. It's not of the same quality. It's not all done at the same time. So there isn't just one Septuagint at all. So is Corey Mahler actually pretending that the Septuagint is inspired? Now, the Septuagint was the Bible of the early church. There's no question about that. Very early on, as the gospel went into the Greek-speaking world, and then into the Latin-speaking world. The bridge that allowed that to happen was the Greek Septuagint. Sure, the New Testament writings are in Greek, but they're in Koine Greek. Septuagint is very much readable to a Koine reader, but there are some eccentricities. There were some developments in the 200 years, but not massively different. And so having the Septuagint allowed for this transition. And, when you start having early translations of the Christian scriptures into other languages, whether it be the Old Latin, Syriac, Bohairic, Sahidic, Coptic, all that kind of stuff. Those are very, very important witnesses to the development of the text of the New Testament. But you have the same thing happening with the Old Testament, not as widely. And what ends up happening, and this has a huge impact on things, follow the line here. As in the history of the church in the New Testament reveals, a division developed very early on between the church and the synagogue. John tells us that anyone who confessed Jesus was going to be put out of the synagogue. And we see this later in history taking place. And then you have persecution against the Christians by the Jews. Paul, the situation that takes place there, and documented for us in the book of Acts. Then that unfortunately then leads to a division that results in an ignorance on the part of most people who are handling the scriptures of the original languages of the Old Testament. And so, Augustine isn't reading the Old Testament in Hebrew. He's not really reading it in Greek either, though he has some functionality in Greek. He primarily reads Latin. And so you had Latin translations, and then Jerome comes along, and he translates, and there had been people who had done portions of it before. Melito talks about it a little bit a century beforehand. But you eventually have the Latin Vulgate as the standard text for the Old Testament, even superseding the Greek, all the way up to the time of the Reformation. And so this is fascinating, because I was going to be talking about this anyway, so track with me here. Try to stay with me. I'm literally going to make a connection between Corey Mahler and the Stone Cult group. The Stone Cold Cult group. And Eastern Orthodoxy. How in the world am I going to do that? Let's see if I can do it. So, the early church, I told the story in the King James Only controversy 30 years ago. When Jerome translated the book of Jonah, Jerome had moved to Bethlehem. He had more direct access to native Hebrew reading rabbis and things like that. And so he rendered the story of the gourd growing over Jonah's head differently than the Greek Septuagint did when he rendered it in Latin. Because living in Bethlehem, he was able to go to the Jewish rabbis and go, what's this referring to? And they're like, well, that's such and such a plant. That's one of the toughest areas, is flora and fauna. If you don't live in the area, then what's this talking about? What kind of a plant is this? What kind of an animal is this? And in some places we really struggle to know. We've gotten better over the years because we've found all these other languages that have maybe cognate terms and stuff like that, so we can shed some light on it that way. But he goes and he asks the rabbis, and they say, "Oh, this is such and such a plan." And so that's how he renders it into Latin, which is different than Greek Septuagint. So the first time that was read in public in Carthage, there was a riot in the streets. People rioted because the story had been changed from what they were accustomed to. And the irony, of course, is that the Greek Septuagint, the Latin Vulgate, becomes the standard text over time, and has to be displaced by the original languages, and it eventually is. I mean, Rome defended the Latin for a long time, but eventually gave in on that too. So, here's where the connection is. The Hebrew term ahav is used many times in the Old Testament. And words have what's called a semantic domain. Some words have a very narrow semantic domain. They are very technical words. They refer to only one thing. Some words have a very large semantic domain. They can be used to refer to all sorts of stuff. And the term ahav can be understood in the Hebrew language to refer to worship and service. So you shall not serve other gods. You shall not worship other gods. The one Hebrew term ahav can be used for both and is translated by different terms in the Greek Septuagint. Part of that being the Septuagint's not a single translation again. It's you had one group over here and they did a translation, and 30 years later these guys do a different translation of different books, and there's no communication between them, and so you can't say there is a specific choice on the part of the Septuagint translators, because we don't know who they were, and they didn't live at the same time, and they weren't in the same place, and they didn't have each other's fax numbers and things like that. So, John of Damascus, John Damascene, you'll see his name in both places. Saint John of Damascus in Roman Catholic and Orthodox parlance is a famous bishop, theologian, who lives after his city and land has been taken over by the Muslims. It's a whole new world. And he wrote in defense of the veneration of icons. His defense of the veneration of icons was absolutely foundational, central to the arguments, conclusions, and decrees of the Seventh Ecumenical Council in 787, called Nicaea II. That council is considered ecumenical by both the Eastern Orthodox churches and by Roman Catholicism. That council anathematized anyone who would either positively say that icons and images are not to be venerated, not to be kissed, or would teach anyone else the same thing. So the council said, you have to do this. This is not something you can be neutral on. It's not something you can go, I don't really care for it myself. No. These have been given to the church as representations. And the key arguments, now, they went to John Damascene, and he gives a lot of quotes from the early church that weren't valid. I'm not saying he made them up, but you have to understand that very early on, there was a lot of forgery going on. If you want to get a book published, you put somebody else's name on your book. So Ignatius of Antioch was a big name, and so we have the genuine epistles of Ignatius written at the beginning of the 2nd century, and then you have a whole bunch of pseudo-Ignatian epistles. You remember when Leighton Flowers got caught up in our debate in 2015, 2016 on Romans 9, and he quotes from Clement And he identified it as being Clement of Rome, hence late 1st century, early 2nd century, when he was actually talking about 2nd Clement, which came long after that. Completely different author. So you have, but the point is they use Clement's name to get the clicks. If you want to use modern terminology, if you want to get the book copied and make some money off of it, get clicks, then you use names of famous people. So Melito of Sardis, famous person, and there's Pseudo-Melito. And those modern designations have only come after the Renaissance and the Reformation, where we've come to learn to recognize anachronism. This was one of the big problems. That's why forgeries were so important in the development of the papacy. The Pseudo-Isidorian decretals, vital to the development of the papacy. Majority of the citations they give of early church writings are fraudulent. No one today defends them. And it's not that people were stupid, it's that people didn't have the perspective to be able to recognize anachronism when it was present in a text. That was something that didn't develop with the Reformation. Lorenzo Valla, really, in the West, was one of the first people to really start developing that idea, and it caught on pretty quickly as it needed to. So the point is, John of Damascus is using lots of forged citations, and his primary biblical argumentation. Remember, this becomes, without this, you don't have Second Nicaea. Without this, you do not have iconography. You have iconoclasm, not iconophilia. You don't have the practice of Eastern Orthodoxy today without John of Damascus's defense of the veneration of icons. And what was all of that based on? It was based on the fact that he didn't know Hebrew. Almost nobody at the time did. In fact, there are only a few early church fathers that were proficient in both Greek and Hebrew. That doesn't mean that you're going to handle the languages right, but it at least gives you all the data. And Jerome was one of them. And John of Damascus was the one who really popularized, I'm not going to say he developed it, but he certainly put the finishing touches on the argument that there is a difference between veneration and worship. That you can venerate an image without worshiping an image. You can bow to an image. You can kiss an image. You can light candles to an image without worshiping it. And this was based upon, it's called proskunesis, from the verbal form is proskuneo. And in the New Testament, you can proskuneo a human being. So certain Roman centurions are proskuneoed. Okay, you bow down in front of a human being. But it's not a religious context. It's a military context. In Revelation chapter 19, when John tries to proskuneo the angel, what does the angel say? Don't do that. Worship only God. So clearly, there is a context where proskuneo is full-on worship. When the disciples saw Jesus after his resurrection, they bowed down, they worshipped him. Proskuneo. Now, there's another term, latruo. And latruo is normally used of worship in the temple, highest form of worship. So in Daniel chapter 7, when the Son of Man appears for the Ancient of Days, he's given a people and they latruo him. Now, here's the point. Both latruo and proskuneo are used to translate the one Hebrew term, ahav, which means to worship or serve. So if you ask the question, does this ironclad distinction exist biblically between veneration and worship? If you start with the original language given to us, the language that God gave us his law in, biblical Hebrew, no. Only the context determines that. And so you can worship and serve in a religious context or a non-religious context. But you are to worship and serve God in the religious context only. So ahav is only to be given to God in any religious context. Anything else is idolatry. And you tell me that when someone holds that icon up and kisses it and prays to it and lights candles to it, that's not a religious context? Of course it is. Hence, it's idolatry. Period. End of discussion. The entirety of John Damascene's argument is invalid biblically. Now, if you're not a Roman Catholic or an Eastern Orthodox, and you're arguing with that, well, good luck. You have fun now. But that's the truth. That's the reality. And that's the cost of having lost Hebrew. In fact, I've told the story before, but at the time of the Reformation, it was dangerous to learn Hebrew. Johannes Reuchlin, interesting fellow, got into some weird numerology stuff and things like that. Sorry I went long here. I hope that's all right, Rich. We'll try to wrap up here fairly soon. Johannes Reuchlin risked his life to learn biblical Hebrew. And the reformers were dependent upon work that he did in producing a Hebrew grammar. See, if he had been caught meeting with a rabbi studying Hebrew, he would have burned at the stake. Been burned at the stake. In those days, learning the language of the Greeks, they were heretics. You could have been burned for that. And so Hebrew was unknown by the vast majority of people. Now, very quickly, the Reformation started changing that. And Hebrew began to be studied, and it became a part of the regular curriculum of biblical studies. And so a lot of the errors that had developed, really starting by the 3rd century, that were based upon an ignorance of Hebrew, began to be corrected. And that has been wonderfully helpful in providing accurate translations, understanding of cognate terms, and all sorts of things like that, since that has taken place. So there's the connection. That loss of Hebrew allowed the development of a completely anti-biblical and idolatrous tradition that was formalized by John of Damascus and became the foundation of the anathemas of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, and became definitional of the religious worship of Eastern Orthodoxy to this day. To this day. And it came from ignorance of Hebrew. Now, it's very obvious Corey Mahler couldn't identify a Hebrew word if it walked up and slapped him in the face. He has no earthly idea what he's talking about. And his ethnic animus against Jews is certainly a part of why he would actually identify the name Yahweh as a demon. The man doesn't know what he's talking about. He is consumed in his self-aggrandizing cultmanship. But leaving that aside, the rest of us need to realize, wow, this is why we need to know church history. This is why sound seminary educations will still emphasize the biblical languages, both of them, over so much of the stuff that people have to take these days. Instead of actually becoming students of the word, they become students of something else, current growth philosophies and things like that. And why, when you look at the history of the Reformation, this was central. You had to learn this stuff. You had to know this. You had to be able to deal with the biblical languages. And what a blessing to be able to have them. I mean, I have more biblical language material on my simply my phone than almost any person possessed only 50 years ago. It's so anyway, got distracted by something there. So that's why the biblical languages are important, and that's why when Corey Mahler goes, God not only caused his word to be translated into Greek, but he then went one step further and destroyed the Hebrew language. This man, again, Joseph Smith, very, very similar, would say just this wild, crazy stuff. Noah landed in North Carolina, and the Garden of Eden was in Missouri. And give these guys some more time. Just keep giving them rope. And they're going to absolutely positively hang themselves. They really, really are. There's no two ways about it. But for the rest of us, God could not have been more clear. The scriptures are Greek. Well, I have on this program many times said that it's vitally important to recognize the importance of the Greek translation of the Old Testament in the history of the New Testament. Very, very important. But that doesn't change the fact that when Jesus read from the prophet Isaiah, he was reading from the Hebrew scrolls, not from the Greek Septuagint. And that remains the original language that God used to reveal his law. And it was the Gnostics who attempted to get rid of the Old Testament and anything that said anything positive about the Jews in the New Testament. Corey Mahler is a modern-day Gnostic. And I say that as a person who's read a lot of Gnostic material. I've warned against people, don't use the term Gnosticism unless you know what you're talking about. I know what I'm talking about, and that's where these guys are coming from. They really are. So keep that in mind as you run into this stuff. Warn people when you hear, hey, did you hear the most recent Stone Choir podcast? Red flags everywhere. Warning, Gnosticism. Run from the Gnostic heretics. So, all right, a couple other things here. Wow. I still have two things. I'll tell you what. Here's my thinking, Rich. You've got travel coming up, and that normally means you got a lot of stuff going on. I know I do. Let's finish this stuff up today and make it the program for the week. And if I need to respond to other stuff, I can record a audio. I know how to upload. I've uploaded it in the past, or you can help me upload to some place that would get to everybody. But we'll just call it good because, like I said, Rich goes out of town later in the week, and so we were going to be limited anyways. I didn't know what was going to happen with the eye appointment and all that other kind of stuff. So I'm going to press on here, try to get this done and get all the topics in that we need to get to. Three other topics real quick. First of all was Soteriology 101, Leighton Flowers responded to Baptist Bovink. Baptist Bovink had pointed out that provisionalism as an actual system is like, 10 years old? Maybe around there, something like that. I forget the first person who used the term, but it was not very long ago. And Leighton had responded, it should be systems, okay. Only one of our belief systems is consistent with that of the first 400 years of Christian teachings, and it isn't Calvinism. And I responded, I think I was at church. I responded, Leighton, you really should avoid church history stuff. You have, people start off with a low amount of credibility in church history to begin with, and you've burned yours up. You confused First and Second Clement in our debate, and then tried to fight that against the obvious reality that you had just face planted on it. And then your defense of Ken Wilson and his outrageously absurd stuff has finished that off. So, as I've explained so many times before, and Leighton, you just do not have the background to be even addressing this. You just don't. Just admit it. Calvinism, Arminianism, provisionalism, all this stuff was not the focus of the writings of the early church. Oh, you can look at this person and go, well, he uses this phraseology, uses that phraseology. You can try to construct as best you can a general idea of where various people were, but that was not what they were focused on. There were no councils that met that talked about this stuff, not until Council of Orange. It's not until Pelagianism and Augustine and all the stuff that comes at that particular point in time, which is developing in the context of all the controversies of the church, the fall of the Western Empire, all that kind of stuff. You can start talking about it at that point, but by then you're getting well past any kind of apostolic period. There's all sorts of, one of the biggest things that has developed by that point that has massive impact across Christian theology, that impacts the ecumenical councils and the development of Marian theology and adoration and Mariolatry, is the rise of the monastic movement. The Desert Fathers, monks become central. And look, men who are in a traditional system that is specifically in opposition to biblical teaching, they're forbidding to marry. They are going well beyond what the apostles ever envisioned. Simon Stylotes is on his pillar over there, and being up on that pillar does not give you spiritual insight. It really doesn't. That's all there now, and that's impacting exegesis and understanding and teaching. And Leighton, you just don't know anything about that stuff. You just don't. And so you say dumb stuff because you don't know what you're talking about. Stop it. And a lot of people do. No question about it. But you just don't understand the development of theology. You don't understand. And it's scary. I would really struggle to see you consistently defend Sola Scriptura. I really would. I'm not sure how you'd pull it off. But I just said, hey, dude, back away from that. That's not going to help you at all. You don't want to go there. Then there was a meme, and I don't think I could pull it up fast enough to display it for you. But there was a meme that someone put up, and it had John MacArthur, the guy from Houston, with the what's his face? I'm trying to find it here. Yeah, I can't find it. John MacArthur, Kenneth Copeland, the smiley tooth guy, and then some Joel Osteen, and then some rainbow frocked priestess chick. Okay, and there's a Catholic going, so how's Sola Scriptura going for you? Or which one of these practices Sola Scriptura, something like that. And, I just briefly commented on it. There's only one person in this meme. There's probably only one person in this meme that even knows what Sola Scriptura is. I don't think Joel Osteen knows what Sola Scriptura is. I don't think the liberal priestess knows what Sola Scriptura is or would care about it. Copeland, are you kidding? No idea. And Copeland's constantly sitting there going, and the Lord told me this, and the Lord told me that. And almost everything he's ever said has been a complete lie. Joel Osteen is in no way, shape, or form limited by the canon to God's revelation. And the priestess lady doesn't believe God's spoken at all. So, I was just like, there is only one person here who is literally seeking to practice Sola Scriptura. Now, you can disagree with him. You can disagree on his eschatology. That's fine. Most of us do. But he's trying to practice Sola Scriptura. It's interesting. There would be some today in the super confessional Reformed community that would dismiss him, would even dismiss him, and say that he's not Sola Scriptura, but Solo Scriptura. I bet you if I did just a little bit of digging on that thread, I would have found somebody making that kind of argument. But I think it's important to understand, Roman Catholics think that all Protestants believe in Sola Scriptura. And believe you me, that is not the case. That is not the case by a long shot. So keep... Okay, hold on a second. Over paedo-baptism, please. Did he, what's that? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I thought someone was commenting on what I was saying right now. And it really throws me off when someone comments on a tweet you wrote 3 months ago. Because you're like, I don't even remember writing that. You have to go back and go, oh, wow, what, 2023? What? How did you even run across that? It really leads to people going, I don't know what's going on here. Anyway, sorry, Philip. You completely threw me off there. All right. Sola Scriptura meme, stuff along those lines. I think it's important to keep that stuff in mind as well. All right. Was there... I don't know. Yeah. I guess we've covered most of that stuff there. Yeah, I think we did. All right. There has been a few people who I'm just checking a few things here. I don't want to miss anything that's going on here. I haven't seen anything else. All right. Well, I guess all the Corey Mahler stuff. Yahweh, John Damascus, Icons, Soteriology 101, and Sola Scriptura. I think we're pretty well covered there. So, as it looks right now, next program will probably be a week from Tuesday. We'll see. If some emergency thing came up, I would imagine Rich could probably do what he's doing right now, maybe on the road. I don't want to make him do that, but I can do it from here with a little bit of help. See, I've got you can see it right there. This is an ATEM, kids. This is an ATEM Mini Pro, and that's what I have in the RV when I'm traveling as well. And Rich was just telling me today that the place where we have it right now, where they're working on repair stuff, has found an inverter that will work for our unit that's more powerful than the one we've got right now. We were having some electrical issues. I'd get out there in the morning to retract the struts, and it would say low voltage. And that's not supposed to happen. If it's plugged into shore power, those batteries should be juiced up and ready to go first thing in the morning. But we were having problems, and so we're going to have some new stuff going. I'm really looking forward to getting back there on the road. As soon as I have the specifics. Now, there's already been an announcement made that that I'll be in Conway, Arkansas, to speak at the seminary on Monday and Tuesday. Now, I don't think that the one is open. I'm not sure if they're both open or not. You have to call the seminary. I don't think they are. But I should be there the 24th and 25th of February. And that means I'll be in Jonesboro 27th through the 2nd of February. And we are trying to set up, we have one debate pretty much confirmed for either the 28th or the 1st. I'm not sure which one of those two. And then Jeremiah Nortier and I are trying to find somebody to do a 2-on-2 debate, but we're struggling with that right now. We're going to keep working. He works hard and pushes on stuff. We're going to try to do 2 debates on the 28th and the 1st, and then I will be preaching at 12:5 Church on the 2nd of March, Lord willing. And my eyeballs don't fall on my head, and all that kind of stuff going on. So that will be coming up, and after today's medical exam, that's looking more likely to happen, which I'm very thankful for. So, anyways, I hope all that information was helpful. Oh, that was the other thing. That was the other thing. Okay. Where did that come from? Oh, I knew I had forgotten to bring something up. There was I forget who sent it to me. I'll just be brief on this because I was already wrapping everything up there. Rich probably started the music or something. I'll just be very straightforward here. I asked the question, do the elders of whatever church it is that J.D. Hall is attending know that he has gone back to doing what he was doing only a few years ago? For those of you who don't know, J.D. Hall founded Protestia, Pulpit and Pen. When I first met him years ago up in Montana for the first time, he was just a Southern Baptist pastor and concerned about what was going on in the Southern Baptist Convention. And then he just swung out into outer space. The stuff that he did for years with Pulpit and Pen, literally calling family members up, calling children up to try to get dirt on their parents, and promising to burn ministries to the ground, and just daily and weekly haranguing of the brethren. The man had no control, and eventually it caught up with him. He was sued by numerous people, lost. He eventually blamed everything on drugs. He had some type of surgery, got hooked on prescription drug pain meds, and it was all due to that. And a couple of years ago, he was removed from the pastorate and disqualified, and basically left public ministry as he had to, should have. And for a lot of us, it was like, thank you, Lord. The constant haranguing and stuff has finally come to an end. The man who said, "I'll burn everybody else down," has burned himself down. We all saw it coming. We all knew it was just the spin was getting tighter and tighter, and eventually it was going to implode. And it did, and we figured, okay. And I saw something, I don't know, about 6 months ago, did an interview, but it still seemed to me like, hey, I'm out here on my farm. I'm happy here. This is where the Lord needed me to be. And I'm like, good. Stay there. Well, he's back. And nothing's changed. There's still no breaks. There's still no ability to... It's still he still has the same attitude that he can read hearts from afar. He can come to conclusions about situations about which he's completely ignorant. He has some special spiritual ability that nobody else has. And he's back to it. I'm already one of his favorite targets to attack me. Nothing new there. It's sad. It's amazing the people that are promoting him don't seem to know what his history is. And then again, there's certain elements of that history that there's no reason that they would know, because it was just such a violation of foundational biblical principles of what you should and shouldn't be doing. And so I simply ask the question, what church, knowing what this man's history is, now maybe they don't know. Maybe they only know a part of it. Maybe they only know what he's told. I don't know. But I will say to them, whoever they are, this man is not qualified to be doing what he's doing. He will self-destruct. He will do a tremendous amount of damage, and he will damage you as well. Your church. You better believe it. You had better believe it. I don't know what you're thinking, but doing this kind of stuff is what got him into the situation that he crashed and burned in, and brought so much disrepute to the name of Christ and to discernment ministry, polemics ministry, whatever you want to call it. He's right back where he was. What? Do you guys know this? Have you given him permission to do this? I just cannot imagine any sound group of elders knowing what I know, and I don't know all of it, but knowing what I know, going, hey, yeah, you go right back at it. You start throwing those fire bombs at people, and you just, you go ahead and do all that stuff. Be nice to know. Be nice to know if they know, and if they approve of it. That's a sad thing, because they need to realize you got a ticking time bomb on your hands. And evidently 2 years off didn't stop any of it. It's a shame. Okay, that was the other thing. All right. We are wrapped up. Well, look at that. Come right up on 2 o'clock our time. That's just about right. Almost a perfect 90 minutes. That'll do it. And obviously, if there's other stuff we need to address, we will let you know on the app, and maybe figure out a way to do it on my own. I've done it before. We can make it work again. Till then, at least till next Tuesday, we'll see you. God bless.